Today's date is Friday, January the 12th, 2024. My name is Crispin Brooks. I'm interviewing Sonia Brody on behalf of the US Seashore Foundation. The interview is taking place in the offices of the US Seashore Foundation in Los Angeles, California, in the United States of America. The language of this interview will be English. Please state your name.
Sonia Brody.
What was your name at birth?
Sonia Dubska.
Did you have any other names, like middle names or anything like that?
My middle name was Esther, biblical name.
Were you named after anyone else in the family at all?
Not in the family, no. I was named, according to my mother, I was named after Sonia Henne, who was a very well-known skater. That's what I was told.
Did you have any nicknames or other names people called you growing up?
Sonichka. Very early on.
Please tell us when you were born.
I was born February 16, 1934.
And where were you born?
In Prague, Czechoslovakia.
And can you tell us a little about your father?
My father was a corporate lawyer in Prague at the time, and with offices and the place where we also lived. In those days, there were the building where we lived, his offices were on the second floor, and we lived on the third floor of that building. And in the main, in the best, not necessarily best, but I mean in the well-known area of Prague, which was the Wenceslas Square.
Do you remember the street address?
I don't remember the exact, it was Wenceslas Square. I don't remember the exact number, but the building now has become a hotel, a very well-known hotel by Yalta Hotel.
And where was your father from?
My father was born in Raskovice in Czechoslovakia, which is about an hour south of Prague. And he did his studies, his legal studies, at the Prague University, Charles University of Prague, actually, the exact name.
And what do you know of his parents?
I don't know very much at all about his parents because both of them, and I do not recall ever seeing them. Both of them passed away by the time I was 2 or 3 years old, and they did not live in Prague, so I did not have much contact with them. And so I don't know very much about them.
They were in Raskovice?
Rakovice, yes.
Was it Rakovice?
Rakovice.
Rakovice.
Sorry.
And tell us a little about your mother.
My mother was born in Prague, and her parents also lived in Prague, and her whole family actually lived in Prague. She had one sister, but both sets of her parents each one had 5 siblings, so there were a lot of extended family, a lot of cousins who all lived in Prague, so we were a large extended family. And her parents, my grandparents, I remember very clearly. They were very nurturing, I would say elegant, looking at the pictures, and as I remember them, people. And I was very close to them as we would get together because they lived in Prague and fairly close to where we lived. We were together quite a bit. So,
Do you remember any of the names of that kind of extended family group? Aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins?
My aunt's name was Mila. My uncle's name, she was married to, his last name was Lederer. I can't at the moment, I don't remember his first name right now. There was a cousin by the name of Yara Milada, Hannah. There were two Hannahs in the family, Hannah Tandler and Hannah Gross. I wasn't prepared for this. I'm sorry for the names.
And what was your mother's maiden name?
My mother's maiden name was Anna Kafka, Kfka.
And was there any connection to the famous writer?
Yes, my grandfather was a cousin of Kafka, the writer, of Franz Kafka.
But he's not someone you recall at family gatherings.
No, that I don't, I have to say.
And did you have any brothers and sisters?
I have one sister, 5.5 years older than I was.
And what's her name?
Her name is Eva Milada Dubskaya initially, and she was married to Don Kushner, who was a cousin of the screenwriter Tony Kushner. She has just passed away. It'll be a year ago next month.
What are your earliest memories?
My very earliest memories are very good and happy life. I was fortunate enough to live not only in a great city, but in good circumstances. And I recall vacations by the seashore and ski trips to the Tatra Mountains, surrounded by a lot of loving family and friends. And I remember as you would call a nanny, if you will, who would take me to parks every day and taught me how to read and have fun and what have you. I have very clear memory of her, even though I must admit, at this stage, I don't remember her name, but I have visual memories of her. And I also recall my mother driving a little convertible car in those days with a little white dog. But overall, my memories of very early childhood are very, very good.
Can you picture your family together, your parents and sister from those early days?
Yes, I definitely can. Let's say, and of fun ski trips, and we were together quite a bit.
Would there have been regular family meal times during the week, or how would it?
At my grandparents, we sacrosanct every Sunday we would gather at my grandmother's and grandfather's and have chicken soup. I remember the chicken soup very vividly, actually. And Friday nights, we would every so often, I don't know if it was every Friday night, but I do remember lighting the candles at my grandparents' home.
And what about during the week? What do you remember? What would happen? What would a normal day be like?
Uh, Honestly, I don't know. I guess we would get up, we would go for walks. I was too little to go. I don't remember being in like a nursery school or anything like that. I do recall my sister, because she was that much older than I, would go to school or to wherever she was going, but I do remember she was out of the house. But personally, I don't remember anything other than just, going out for walks and ice cream and that kind of thing.
And I forgot to ask, what did your mother do for work?
My mother was a stay-at-home mother. She was married she was young. She was 19 when she was married, and 20 when my sister was born, and never worked actually at all. I mean, she was a stay-at-home, and she was the type she was very social. In those days, she would go to what we called in Czech kavarnas, coffee houses were very popular in those days in Prague. And as far as I know, I think maybe even on a daily basis, I'm not sure though, she would go and meet friends in coffee houses.
Was this
And there
something
was a
just
lot
for
of
her,
social.
or did you go along with her, or did she do that on her own?
No, she did that on her own. I do. And she would come and pick me up or meet me at the park and that kind of thing. But this was her social circles were on her own.
And what do you know about how long, her side of the family had been in Prague, going to the sort of longer, deeper family history?
As far as I know, my great grandparents were in Prague. So certainly on my grandmother's side, whose name was before she married my grandfather, before she became of Kafka, she was a Schön. And the Schön family, as far as I know, her parents were in Prague as well.
And did you know of any, earlier than that about, stories about the family and the longer history where they'd been and that kind of thing?
No, I don't. I'm sorry. I don't know much.
And on your father's side in Rakovice?
I don't either.
Okay. And then going back to, you were talking about your mother and she was socializing with her friends. Who would her friends have been, do you know?
Some cousins first. She had all her cousins were friends of hers as well, and wives of my father's associates, and but that's all I can tell you about her friends, really.
And did your parents ever have people in your home to socialize?
Yes, quite often they would have reception or an evening or dinner, not on a regular basis that I can remember, but I do remember some socializing in the apartment, which was a very large apartment. It wasn't a house, as I say. It was in a big building, and it was a large apartment.
Can you walk us through, kind of from your memories, what sense you have of it? What you know, if I was to
Yeah.
walk with you in your memory, what would we see?
Well, you would enter and into a large hall, and on the right side, you would go into another hall that would lead to a living room, I guess you would call it, the main area of the apartment, which would then extend into a dining room, which would extend into the kitchen. And the bedrooms were on the other side of the hall, of the entrance hall. There were four bedrooms that I can remember. And my own particular bedroom, that's something I remember very clearly, was painted orange. And I think my love of orange color comes from these early days. I do remember my bedroom.
Were there any special toys or that you remember?
I remember playing with a doll and a doll. I remember a doll in a dollhouse, and what do you call these things you push down and they twirl?
Like a carousel?
Carousel type thing. Yeah, I remember that.
Were there particular books or stories that you read or were read to you that you
Yes, I don't remember. I don't remember any. I can't name any books, but I remember being surrounded by around my bed. There were shelves with books, and my father would read to me every night. It was all in Czech, and I assume that they were fairy tale stories. But a lot of my memories have faded over the years, and so.
Do you remember any hobbies or like early interests at that time?
Not really, I have to say. No. I mean, I always liked to do things with my hands, and I guess you would call them puzzles. I don't know if you called them that then, but I remember putting things into boxes and that kind of thing. But a hobby per se, before I was 5, I don't remember, no.
And what was the language or what were the languages spoken at home?
Czech. We spoke Czech, and I do know, I don't remember hearing it too much, but I do know that both my parents spoke, and particularly my mother spoke German as well. because in those days the second language in Czechoslovakia was German. But I don't remember them actually talking or speaking in German. At home it was always Czech, and I never knew any other language but Czech in the early days.
Was any Yiddish spoken in the family? Do you know?
On occasion, I remember my grandparents speaking a language which at the time I did not identify as Yiddish, but probably was.
And thinking back either to your immediate family, parents and sister, or to the bigger family gatherings on a Sunday, can you tell us about some of the personalities and what you remember from back then?
Yeah, we were, I would say, what you would call an assimilated family in terms of religion, if you will. We were not particularly, observant, but we were Czech first and Jewish second. But I do recall that one of my father's sisters, my father had two sisters, one of them became a Zionist and moved to, in those days, Palestine in 1938. And I recall at the time the family was kind of divided as to why would she do this, and yes, it's a good thing she did that. I saw her once after that when many years later I traveled to Israel, but she never came back to Prague.
What was her name?
Her name was Olga, and her
Dubska.
married name, right, Olga Dubska, and her married name was Olga Goral. She ended up marrying a Palestinian Jew, actually, combination, which was very interesting.
And within your immediate family, do you know how your parents felt about her decision about Zionism in general?
They were pretty divided on that, I would say. My father was very concerned about the fact that we were Jewish, because I think he saw what was happening. I was under 5 years old. I can't remember. I can't tell you exactly what was going on. At this age, things happen. Anyway, but I do remember, and I do also. I think a lot of it might have come back to me after the war or during the war, but I do think that he was concerned about what the writing on the wall was back in 38, starting in 36, 37, 38. My mother somehow, I think, if I remember, did not really want to face it, is the way I would put it now. And the rest of my family, I remember also very clearly as before we left, my grandparents saying, just you have to leave and nothing will happen. We'll be fine here, because they were not able to leave.
going back to your parents and sort of their, in this case, kind of political outlook, what do you know of, or do you know anything about, what their politics were, who they might have voted for, what were their kind of values in terms of who they liked, disliked, and that kind of thing?
No, honestly, I don't remember that.
And you'd mentioned you were assimilated, but you'd also said, your grandparents, I think, you would light a candle on Shabbat.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us more about, your religious observance and holidays and things like that?
You mean mine or
Well,
them?
yeah, yours in those early days in Prague with the family.
Um, I remember maybe going to temple every so often, but not necessarily on a regular, just on holidays, and the lighting of the candles. That's all in terms of, observance of religion. I don't remember talks specifically about being Jewish. Later on, I realized later on, because of the war, that being Jewish had some connotations, but it never seemed, in my early days and early memories, it never seemed to be an issue or that it was talked about. And that's why when Hitler walked in, it was a shock.
Before we get there, do you remember having friends in those early days in Prague?
Yes, a couple of. I used to meet them in the park. A couple of. I don't remember necessarily the name. One of them was Carl. He was a little boy about my age, and then there was a little girl who was the daughter of some friends of my parents, whose name was, like my sister's name, Eva, I guess in English. And we used to play in, in sand boxes and running around the park and that kind of thing. But that's about it. I remember just two close friends from those days.
And do you know if they were Jewish or not Jewish?
They were Jewish. That much I do know.
And outside of your family and let's say these friends, do you know if your parents mostly socialized with other Jews or a mixture or non-Jews or?
Mostly Jews that I know. Yeah, we were, because my parents were part of the Jewish community. I didn't mean to imply that there were not. They were actually, my father was rather a prominent lawyer in Prague in those days, and he was part of the Jewish community, definitely.
And do you know any stories about him as a lawyer?
All I've always heard was that he was, rather well known, and he had two associates, one of whom actually followed him pretty well throughout the war, and even until after the war, and many years later, ended up in Los Angeles. And I am now even friendly with his daughter in Los Angeles, who lives in Los Angeles. And so...
What was the associate's name?
I know you were going to answer.
Sorry.
I know it's on the tip of my tongue.
Okay.
It'll come back to me. Mahler. Okay. František Mahler was his name. And
Mahler or Mahler? Like the composer?
Mahler. And he later changed his name after arriving in Los Angeles, I think. He changed his name to Marlowe. Marlow. And his daughter, who I'm friendly with, who is now in her 60s, 70s, or 60s, I guess, late 60s, is Susan Marlowe.
And who would you say were the influential people in your life in these first 5 years?
Definitely my parents, my grandparents, and my sister, who was 5.5 years older. Because of the age difference, I didn't really have that much contact with her, because by the time I was born, she was 5.5 years old. She was extremely intelligent, very creative. She wrote poems by the time I was born, apparently, and even recited poems for the president of Czechoslovakia, is what I have heard and I have seen of her writings. And she later actually studied literature and did write quite a few books. But she was not such a big influence in I don't remember her as being very protective of me or anything like that. I do remember her, being the older sister, but so much older that we didn't have that much in common. But I would say my grandparents were the most prominent figures in my childhood.
I forgot to ask, what were their names?
Hermina was my grandmother, and Bertik, which would probably be translated as Bertrand, was my grandfather.
And last name was Kafka?
Kafka.
And do you have any sense of, growing up as a girl actually, before I got to ask about that, I wanted to ask about your maid. Would you describe her as a governess or a maid, or what would the...
Definitely a governess.
And can you tell us a little bit more about any interactions you remember with her?
Oh, she was around all the time. And I remember her as a very vivacious person, curly, short hair. I remember her holding my hands, getting me dressed, getting me ready to go to places, putting me in the carriage from the time that I was very early. My first memories in the carriage, then, a stroller, and then I remember often her pulling me in a little kind of wagon for fun. She would tell me stories, which I do not remember, but I remember sitting next to her and her talking a lot. We sang songs every so often. But that's about, again, I can visualize this. I can't tell you exact memories.
Do you know if she was Jewish or not Jewish?
She was not Jewish. That I know because later on, I remember my mother telling her, you are in danger here with us. She said, I won't leave you. That I remember. But,
and do you know if was she from Prague or from other parts of the country? Or?
I don't know.
So I wanted to ask about sort of growing up as a girl in Prague and the environment you grew up in. What would the expectations of you have been at that age? What was the kind of the thinking about what you would have done in a normal world going into life?
I expect that the expectation would have been to go to school, to be, I don't know whether at the time would have been to go on to higher education. I think probably so. But I can't tell you what my parents expected of me, and I don't know what would have. But I do know that it would have been, certainly education was very important to my parents. And as an Nakotay, I can also tell you that I know that my mother would have wanted to go on to higher education and university. But in those days, in her generation, it wasn't done, especially if one was married as early as she was. So she never went on. But I do remember her saying to me later on when we were as adults that she would have wanted to go on, but that was not her parents' expectations in those days.
And did she say what she might have wanted to do?
Well, she had one cousin who managed to do that, and she said, maybe I would have wanted to do what Ilana did and finally achieved, was to go to medical school, possibly.
Mm-hmm. And a couple of last questions just about your kind of home life and family life. Do you remember art or music or sport?
A lot of music. I don't remember. Tennis, and was prominent in the family. Both my mother and my aunt, her sister, who was 2 years younger than she, played a lot, and my brother-in-law and my uncle played a lot of tennis. I don't recall my grandparents playing any sports, but I do recall my father and mother. And we did a lot of skiing was a big thing. Swimming. And but tennis days is very clearly in my mind.
And would this have been in Prague or during vacations that you remember?
Well, I remember during vacations, but I wouldn't be surprised that they did also, play. Maybe instead of going to the coffee house one afternoon, they would go play tennis. But I can't vouch for that, honestly.
And with the family vacations, you mentioned going to the shore. What shore would that have, what body of water would that have been? Do you know?
Mostly lakes, and we would go to the Adriatic Sea, take, that for ocean water, whatever it was.
Do you remember how you got there?
I think by car. Yeah.
So your family owned a car?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, tell us about that.
Yeah. Oh, I thought I had mentioned. I remember my mother drove a little Tatra convertible, and we would go on that. In that, I mean, my father would drive, but that's where we would go. I don't remember. I think maybe there was another car, but I don't. I mainly remember that Tatra car.
And music.
My parents were very into opera, and I remember being taken early on to the I guess concert hall of Prague to listen to La Traviata was one of their favorite opera, and that's what they took me to once or twice. I remember that.
How was that you must have been 4 or 5 or something that age?
I was, which was early on, but I remember that quite clearly, actually. I was most impressed by that. So, yes, they were, they were quite social, and they would have, I assume, what you would now call subscriptions to the Opera House, which was a very beautiful one in Prague, and same for theater. I think they had season tickets to the theater.
Do you remember any trips to the theatre?
No, that I don't.
What about cinema to see movies?
Mm-mm. No, I don't.
Did your family take any newspapers or journals that you remember?
I do remember newspapers around, but
And you'd mentioned that your sister wrote poetry,
Mhm.
and rather well, and to the
Yeah.
point where she read for the president of the
President
country,
Benesch, right?
of
Mhm.
Benesch, right?
Mhm.
Can you tell us more about that and the role of kind of literature in your home, or what you know of it?
Um, I do know we had a lot of books around. And my father's office was full of books. I don't know whether there were law books or any other books, but both our apartment and my father's office was full of books. But that's all I can tell you. Specifically, which books, I don't know. But they were all, another thing I do remember, they were very beautiful, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of more, I don't want to say ancient, but rare books. They had rare books, bindings, and that kind of thing, I remember.
What do you remember about things starting to change?
I remember back in 1938, when I was about 4 years old, not quite 4 years old, I remember things starting to change in terms of the behavior of people around me. And I assume it was after the Anschluss and after the Sudetenland was taken over in Czechoslovakia, or actually, as we learned later, it was given to them, given for the promise of Hitler not continuing on invasion. And but that's the time I recall my father starting to be very concerned about the future. And I remember people around me having conversations that in those days didn't really mean much, and I did not understand. But I recall specific sentences here and there about, oh, nothing's going to happen, or contradictory things like, oh, they'll get us, we're Jewish, we're sure to, something will happen, or we have to leave, and no, what can they possibly do to us? I remember specifically my grandparents saying, what can they do to us? We are, we've been here, we haven't done anything, what can happen? So these type of conversations kind of still kind of resound in my head and people also, I felt that the behavior of people towards me was starting to change. Nobody was paying that much attention to me anymore. And that's why I think I remember my governess being there more, because the adults around me were obviously kind of looking at something more than just, taking care of me. So, and I remember also my father telling my mother, take the children to, I think it was Teplice, I don't remember exactly, which was one of the places we used to vacation in, and just take them away from Prague for a little while. And I think that was at the time that it was towards the end of 1938, when the writing was on the wall that something was going to happen, but we, didn't know when or why. So we went, I remember being away with my mother, my sister, and I in Teplice for several weeks. And that was while my father decided to apply for a visa to get us out, because he says we've got to get out. And he applied for a visa. I don't remember the exact date, but for all of us, for the whole family, his visa came, and he left in, I think it was January, February 1939.
And this was a visa to where?
To France. He had applied for a visa to France because he had connections in France, and he thought we would start there. Eventually, I think his thought was to literally emigrate to Canada, where he had actually bought a piece of land in, of all places, Manitoba, I think it was. But anyway, it sounds funny now, but I think that was the ultimate goal eventually. But he applied for a visa to France because he had connections in France, and he figured we'll start there. But his own visa came. Ours did not. The rest of the family did not. So he left in January, sometime in the middle of January, I believe, 39. And I recall saying goodbye to him, and I recall being very sad because it would have been the first time that he would have been away to a foreign place, a long way away. And I remember crying and saying, "Why is Daddy leaving?" And never really got an answer. But he left, and figuring if he gets out, he will be able to expedite things for us. Once he was out, he would be able to help get us out faster or whatever. Unfortunately, Hitler invaded Prague much faster than anyone expected. And within about 4 to 6 weeks of him being gone, Hitler walked in on March 15, 39. And up to a certain point, after the invasion, the Germans allowed people to get out for several, I think up to about August, if you had a visa. But we waited for the visa, and that's where we were. We were in Teplice, waiting for visas to arrive, and thinking once my father was out, he would be able to help. And anyway, to make a long story short, our visas, we waited, did not come. And I remember conversations at the time of my parents, my grandparents, my mother, my aunt and uncle, talking a lot about how to get out with or without a visa. What would we do? And they mapped out a route, if you will, whether we had a visa or not. My grandparents urged my mother to take her 2 girls, and go rejoin my father, however way we could.
Do you know what was involved in that route?
Oh yes, I do, and I'll come to that. But the story is that our visas just did not arrive. So it was decided we would just, my mother would run away. As it happened, on the very last day of the Germans allowing people to get out, our visas, my mother's visa and ours, arrived, but only allowing us to go only to Austria, which was kind of ridiculous because Austria was under the Anschluss, was already occupied by the Germans, right? So at that point, the family decided, okay, you've got to go. Told my mother, you've got to go, and you've got to rejoin Joseph, my father. And we were to go from Prague to Vienna from Vienna to Zagreb in Yugoslavia, from Yugoslavia to Italy, crossing to Italy, and from Italy to France. So it was quite a roundabout way to get out, but that was what they had. And my father, from where he was, and my mother, to as much as she could, they were trying to communicate and had people meeting us at various points to help us cross into France. So the day came where we actually left, and I remember.
And you left from Teplice?
No, we came back to Prague. We left from Prague to get on the train, and my uncle accompanied us to the train station. And that was a very, very emotional time for my mother and for my sister and I, to leave our grandparents and leave the family and the extended. I left out, but there were people coming and going all the time, the cousins, and, we were, as I said earlier, a large extended family. And, but we left, and we got to, so my uncle accompanied us to the train. We boarded the train to Vienna, where we were supposed to meet a friend who was to help us get to the next step. And arriving Vienna, I have very clear memories of instead of meeting the friend who was supposed to, finding the friend who was supposed to meet us, we were stopped by, getting off the train. My mother was stopped by a Gestapo, and who told her, we know you are going to meet your father. We want to know your husband, to her. And, but you are going to go back to Prague. And there was chaos at this train station. My mother, I recall holding her hand. I was terrified. There were soldiers everywhere, chaos, people coming, going. And when the German said that to my mother, she whispered to me, cry, and which was not difficult because I was really scared. Anyway, I recall being very scared, and I had to go to the bathroom, and I started crying. And so she said to the German who was standing there with his rifle, I have to take her to the bathroom, otherwise she'll get sick. And he said to her, all right, take her, it's over there, take her, but leave your other daughter here. And my mother said, no, she also needs to go to the bathroom. And kind of exasperated, he said, oh, all right, okay, well, take her, but leave all your bags here. We had packed kind of handbags, whatever we could carry, little handbags with, whatever, a change of clothes maybe, and something to eat. So when he said that, he said, okay, put everything in front of me and come right back. So my mother said to us, okay, which I had 2 little bags. I think Eva, my sister, had 2 bags, and she had 2 bags. We put everything in front of them and headed for the bathroom, which fortunately was kind of behind, in train stations, there's various train tracks, one in front of, one behind the other. And the bathroom was kind of at the back of the train where we had gotten off from, and that he wanted us to get back on because they were going to send us back. And so we went in that direction. And as soon as my mother realized he wasn't watching us anymore because we were behind, we ran into the bathroom and ran out. And my mother saw a train that was heading in the opposite direction of where the Prague train was going to go back. It was a freight train with kind of, the sliding doors kind of open. We didn't know what was there, but my mother, and it was starting to move very slowly. My mother said to my sister, "Jump on that train. I'll take Sonia and we'll jump together." And so we ran and we jumped on that train. Somehow or other, I can't tell you how, but we ended up, I guess, pushing one of the doors. We ended up on our knees inside that freight car, head down. And so my sister had jumped on her own, and my mother dragged me on. And we ended up in that car. And once we kind of recovered and took we were able to stand up, we realized we were in a car with a cow and some hay, which was, kind of weird and funny at the time. I mean, here we were, but we were safe. However, and obviously the train was going, it picked up speed and we were off. So my arriving Zagreb, however, it was obviously going to Zagreb. It had Zagreb that my mother had seen. It had that sign, and which is where we wanted to go anyway.
Did you still have your visa-related or your travel-related papers with you, or had you left them with the German?
I think my mother had her papers with. Yeah, she had some papers, because I also later on remember we burned everything. To this day, I don't have a birth certificate. So once we arrived in Zagreb, and by the way, there were a couple of stops and the train, I remember a train man coming in and my mother explaining to him that we were running away from Hitler, and he said, "Okay, you can stay and go on." And arriving the train station in Zagreb, which at the time was not yet occupied, we also realized there were other people who had tried the same thing, and there were a few of us on that freight train that were escaping. But in our particular, so arriving in Zagreb, we had my mother didn't even have enough money to make a phone call, to try to reach the person who was supposed to help us. Where was my train of thought? I just left my train of thought here. Oh yeah, she did have some money, and that's where her papers were sewn on into the inside of the raincoat she was wearing. However, that money, that was not of any use. Oh, she had jewelry also, but that was of no use to us then, at that time. Fortunately, so she was not able to call the person that she was supposed to contact. Fortunately, as we were walking out of the train station, there was an older lady who was kind of across the street for us. We were walked. She was here, and somehow or other, whether I guess she realized we were kind of distraught or kind of without, needed help. I don't know, but she came over and she said, "Can I help you?" to my mother. And my mother said to her, I guess it was in Czech. I don't, now that you mention it, I'm not sure exactly how they communicated. My mother, I think, also spoke some Hungarian, but this lady spoke, I think she spoke Czech. My mother told her, we just came off this freight train. We're running away running away from Hitler. And this lady, whose name I think was Helene was her name, her first name, I don't remember the last name, said to her, "Well, I'm immigrating and I'm waiting in Zagreb for my visa to go to Australia. And I'm living right now in a hotel across the street. And if you want to, I can help. You can come and rest." I guess we must have looked pretty ragged or tired or what have you. And if you want to, I can take you to my room and you can rest there and have something to eat and what have you, and you can make your phone call. So that was a good Samaritan that really helped us out. And we did spend the night in that hotel. And my mother was able, because of this lady, to make the phone call to it was a distant cousin that was in Yugoslavia that was going to help us to get across. And he came for us the next day and helped us to the village, the name of which I don't remember at the moment, which is the border town that has a bridge to Italy, from Yugoslavia to Italy. Again, it'll come back to me.
For someone near Trieste or something like that?
No, the border town is not Trieste. We had to get across to Italy.
So we can come back
to it. And from there we went to Trieste. But the actual border town is at the end of the bridge is different from Trieste. So he got us to the bridge and walked halfway and told us at the time, you better wait and not cross the bridge during the day. It's easier. There are a lot of spies around, German spies. You better wait until nighttime. It's easier to cross the bridge. And so he took us halfway down the bridge and we said our goodbyes. Everything was fine. Fine by that, went without any problems up to then. And he turned away. We said our goodbye. He went back there and we started across from the other middle of the bridge across into Italy. It was a fairly long bridge. And as we were walking, running across the bridge, we heard shots. I don't know if they were directed at us or not, but that really made us run. And we did manage to cross, despite the shots. We really crossed over into Italy and unharmed and court-free. From there, we made our way to Trieste. again, I have no clear memories of how and what, and all I know is that we made it to Trieste. From Trieste, we went to a roundabout way to Marseille, and from Marseille to Paris, where my father was supposed to meet us.
Was this all by
Again,
land to Marseille?
yes, yeah, it was crowded trains, buses, walking, however we could. All I know is that by the time we reached Paris, with where my father was, to meet us, and I recall also being quite sick, crying a lot, scared, and sick. And my mother told me afterwards that apparently I had the chicken pox during that time, which I don't really remember. Can I take a break for a minute?
Yes,
Yeah.
let's take a break right there. So before we took a short break, you were talking about your arrival in France and meeting your father again, but I wanted to go back to a few memories of Prague before we talk about France. And well, one question, and then you had something you remembered. There was an incident that you said that happened in Prague.
Yes, one night before we left, I recall a knock at the apartment door. I don't know who opened the door, and that was after the Nazis walked into Prague. And I recall watching the Germans come down Vanceslav Square, where we live, watching them from the balcony of my father's office, coming down the square. And I can't remember exactly how many, if it were a couple of weeks or days, but one night there was a knock at the door of the apartment, and I don't recall who opened the door, but somebody in the family opened the door. My grandparents were in our apartment with a couple of my mother's cousins, and two Nazis were at the door and pushed everybody towards the back of the apartment and said to my mother, we're looking for Anna Dubsky or some, I guess I'm not sure but I do recall that she and the Nazis were talking. And they said, we know your husband is out of the country. Where is he? And what is he doing? And why did he leave? And kind of starting to question her. And they, as I said, they had pushed everybody into the back of the room and were talking to my mother. And I recall my mother saying something so shocking to me at the time that I started crying. And she said to them, I don't know where my husband is. We were not getting along very well together for a while, and he just left us. And I really don't know where he is. Whether the Germans bought this or not, I don't know. But I recall my emotions at the time when she said that they weren't getting along and he had left. I started crying and I pulled my sister. I remember pulling at my sister's hand and asking her, has Daddy abandoned us? Is he not coming back? And my sister just said to me, stop crying. Whether because she was that much older, she understood the situation and thought we better just, the less said, the better, I don't know. But that did not calm me. It made it worse for me, actually. And but finally, there were more questions to my mother, and they said, okay, that's fine, but from now on, starting tomorrow, we want you and your two girls to come to the commandanture twice a day to check in. So after that day, every day we would set out in the morning and in the late afternoon to check in with many other Jews in Prague to the commandanture to make sure that, we were still there. I mean, that we had to check in with them every day. And I remember those kind of walks through the city as kind of grim. Everything was gray. People were huddled in corners. And what I found, and I remember till this day, still disturbs me to a great extent, the Nazis walking through the city with their boots and their, clanking, dressed in green, gray, blue uniforms, or double motorcycles going through the city. But most disturbing to me was the Heil Hitlers as they were passing each other, because every time a German met another German, they had to go Heil Hitler. And these sounds resounding through the city I remember that at most disturbing. And that's something that still bothers me today, I have to say, whenever, and Nazis' flags around the buildings. So that was a period period before we actually left Prague. But I remember that as a very grim time, these daily walks to the commandantures. So that's why, that's what I wanted to put in before leaving.
You mentioned it, I think, but do you remember the day when the Germans arrived?
Well, yeah, I remember that. I remember from just history and knowing. I know it was March 15th, 1939. But the day itself started like any other day, as far as I can remember. But it was early morning when the troops came in, and there were, people started saying, oh my gosh, the Germans are here, they're arriving, and they came in. So we ran, whether it was maybe they had heard on the radio, I don't know, but I recall going to the balcony, my family going to the balcony and watching them come down, because Wenceslas Square is not an actual square. It's actually a very long boulevard with the Prague Theater at the very top and the statue of St. Wenceslas on a horse, and a very long boulevard. So they started coming from the theater down the boulevard, first with a few motor cars with Nazis' flags and, I guess big Nazi wigs. I don't know who they were, but, with their uniform in their uniforms, and then rows and rows of Germans in marching down, followed again by other cars, but there were, and so that was the day, and from that day on, restrictions started immediately. Yellow stars for whoever was Jewish, daily, well, I don't know if the rations started right then, but there were definitely restrictions and orders, blaring orders that curfew at a certain time at 5 o'clock or whatever time, I don't remember, but they were blaring orders on with the cars with what do you call them? Anyway, I'm sorry, I don't at this point. I'm losing the words. For what? The microphones? No, not
megaphones.
Megaphones, yeah. Megaphones, right. As to what you could, when you could not do, what time you had to have curfew, and if you were found on the street, you would be shot. I don't know specifically whether they said that or not, honestly, but I think it was something like that, yeah. And so it was kind of a grim time,
Do you remember the actual yellow star and having to wear it?
It had to be sewn on. Yes, I did have it, and so did So, what amazes me till today is the organization the Nazis had. They knew exactly how many Jews were in any given city, in any given district, in any given street. They were so amazingly organized that they knew who was where. It was, to me, that's still incredible. And surprising, but they were so intent on eliminating all the Jews that, by however means they had, they found out who was where.
Do you know, when you left Prague, were you still wearing the yellow star?
No, that I don't know, honestly. I don't think so. I think my mother ripped it off. No, I'm sure, actually, because that's why, she didn't want to be, we didn't want to be identified as Jews, so she ripped it off.
And
that's why I don't have it, actually.
What do you know of how local non-Jews reacted to, the presence of the Nazis?
All I can tell you is that I don't know at the time how they reacted. What I do know is that after the war, they were not very happy with the Jews because they claimed that because of the Jews, they suffered, the rest of them suffered. And I remember that because we did return to Prague for a short time after the war. And even though we had lost everything, won't go into it now, but I do recall that some of the Czechs that were not Jews blamed the Jews for the hard times that they had had.
Were those, conversations you heard, things said to you or to your mother, or how did it come through to?
My father and my mother talking about it. Yes. But I also have to say that because most of my father and mother's social ties were with Jews, I don't think they knew that many personal friends who were not Jewish. So I think it was mostly through conversations that they had with people that I gathered that.
And before you left in 1939, before you left Prague in 39, do you know of any incidents, either that you or your family members, any incidents of like anti-Semitism that they experienced?
No, I have to say I don't recall any serious anti-Semitic behavior from anyone. And as I said, I think we lived pretty freely in, we were known as Jews. I know we were, but I do, as I said earlier, I think my family identified as Czech Jews, not Jews who are Czechs. So that that maybe, and I think most of the people that we knew, or that my parents knew, were okay with the fact that we were Czech and we were also Jewish. It was, but I don't remember any strictly anti-Semitic behavior from
Or
anyone.
stories in the family of something that happened to someone else?
No, I don't have any memories of that.
You mentioned this story that your mum said about how she was having problems with your father and implying to the Germans that he might have run off. Did she ever placate you and tell you,
Yes, after that evening, that same evening, after they had left, and we were supposed to, they told us you're supposed to come every day to the commandantur. She took me aside and she said, stop trying. I had to say that to the Germans to protect Daddy and us, because the Germans are very bad people and they can do a lot of harm. And I accepted that, but was still kind of, very, I remember my feelings at the time. I accepted, okay, so they're bad, but why are they bad? And why being Jewish is, I remember questioning myself and my sister, who never gave me an answer either. There is some stigma, something attached to being Jewish, and so. But she did tell me, and those words I remember very clearly. They are very bad people who can do a lot of harm to us and to Daddy. So I have to say that. And also said, but we will rejoin, we will go, we will see Daddy again.
And just before we go to that again, other than the sort of walks, these kind of gloomy walks to the commandatur, do you remember what actually happened when you were there?
Yes, we had to check in, write our name. There was lists of, they had big sheets on each table as we were coming. There was a German sitting. You'd walk in and there was a long table with maybe 3 or 4 Germans sitting in front of sheets of papers with names on it. You had to put your name and I think give a fingerprint every day, twice a day, with your name. And again, this is from hearing or from history. I don't recall that. But I think what they would do then is check your name against some files that were in the back of them and, just double check that we were actually the person that they were looking for or that they were supposed to sign it.
Tell us about reuniting with your father in Paris.
Well, after all I can say is that from the moment we left Prague to arriving in Paris took us about something like 3 weeks. And after having reached France through Italy from Trieste, we went through a roundabout way. Again, I don't know how it happened and why we did it this way, but it was kind of a detour through France. We ended up in Marseille, and from Marseille to Paris took us 3 days by train and bus. Or by bus first, I think train, because I remember my father. And then somehow or other, again, I don't know how, and I don't remember my mother even later telling me exactly how, or we talked, because so much was going on, and over the years, but I don't remember exactly how, but they communicated, and my father knew we would be arriving by train in Paris and would meet us there. So we arrived, I believe it was the Gare d'Austerlitz to Paris, and he was waiting for it. And all I can recall is I was so happy because he was there, and I remember running into his arms and felt so much better and relieved and happy. And he took us to an apartment that he had rented, which was very small, but it felt like a castle to me because we were together. We had, and he was there, and so I felt okay. What happened next, however, was also unexpected, and within about 2 weeks of us arriving in Paris, he was called up to the Czech army in exile that was had to leave to go to London. And so again, he was going to leave. We were going to follow. We couldn't leave with the troop. He had to go with the troops, and we were to leave on the ferry that was running between France and England. And at the time, you didn't travel the way we travel today. The only way to get to England was through the Channel on the ferry. But in order to get to the ferry, you had to go to, is it Saint-Malo? To the port city. To make a very long story short, we missed the very last ferry to cross from England from France to England. No more transportation moved between France and England. So we somehow or other, my mother at the time still was able to communicate somehow with my father. And he arranged for us to go to, or he told my mother to find a way or something. I'm not sure exactly how it all happened. But we ended up in a city in the Charente called Cognac, where they actually make the cognac.
Before we get there, I'm just thinking that you'd only just reunited with your father.
For a couple
then
of
you
weeks.
were separated. Do you remember that
And we
second
were
separation?
Yes, I remember the separation. As he was going off, and I recall again, my gosh, my father's going again, but this time it's. But he said to us, I will see you soon. I will see you in London. And I was, again, pretty distraught at him leaving, but with the thought and the hope that we would rejoin him within a few days, because at the time that France was not yet occupied either.
Was this still in 1939, or was this already in 1940?
This was, I think, the end of. This was in still 39, I believe. Yeah, it was still in 39. I don't remember.
And so, how did it come that you? How did it work out that you ended up going to Cognac?
Because my mother, through some channels, heard that there was a Czech enclave supposedly in Cognac. There were some other Czechs. So, and how we actually physically got there, my memories are very, very, not really very clear of that, I have to say. What is clear that once we got to Cognac, we did meet a couple of Czech families, mainly women and children, and I recall becoming friendly with one of the girls of some of the Czech. How these Czechs got there, I don't know, but I was told years later that they were remnants of families that had ended up there from World War I. Whether that I can't really verify that. I could not or would not. I just took it for it, but that's the stories that I heard about.
Were they also
why there
Jewish?
Were some Czechs.
Were they also Jewish?
I don't think so. And that, however, arriving in Cognac, we ended up in a little hotel called Hôtel de France I remember the exact address, which was 9 Rue Plumegeau. The hotel, by the way, it does not exist anymore. And my mother asking for a job because she realized being alone, she would have to support us, and realizing that, you know, my father was gone, we may not be able to reunite for a while. She actually told the owners of the hotel that we were Czech refugees running from Hitler. She admitted to them that we were Jewish. That did not stop them from taking us in and giving her a job as a waitress first, and then she became manager of the hotel somewhere down the line.
And she spoke some French.
She spoke some French. That's one thing about my mother. She spoke German, Czech, German, and French fairly well. That's one thing. She had, that's an à côté, but she had an education. As I told you earlier, she had wanted maybe to get, higher education, but she did go to a boarding school in Switzerland for a year where she learned French. So she spoke French, fluently, and German fluently, and Czech. So, so that did not deter. The Nabholz was the name of the owners of the hotel, who were initially Swiss, and that will come in. The reason I mention that is that will come in handy because they passed us, even though we knew they were Jewish, they passed us to the community at large as distant cousins from Switzerland. So our name, we didn't have to change our name. Our name did not seem very strange or foreign to anybody, being cousins of the Nabholzes in Switzerland. Where was I? Yeah. So they did not, and never betrayed us to anybody. But shortly after we got to Cognac, it was invaded by the Germans. And that is the point at which my mother said to my sister and I, from now on, forget you are Czech, forget you are Jewish. You are going to be living as little Protestant girls. I was terrified. I recall feeling, where am I? What am I supposed to do? What am I? And once she told me that, I literally became mute for, both my sister and mother say, a period of 6 to 8 months, I'm not sure. But my internal feelings were, I have to stay mute, which was not difficult because I didn't speak French. The only language I knew was, I was 5 years old, the only language I knew was Czech. I felt totally lost, totally kind of didn't want to be seen, I was totally, as I say, mute for a long period of time. And what is interesting is that I learned, I'm sure that that's how it happened, and later on as a psychologist that I ended up by being, I realized I absorbed the language as by osmosis, literally, and did not start really speaking French until I knew enough to speak it. It was very interesting. But in the meantime, I guess I got off on a tangent here for a while. So my mother also, in order to appear as, quote, normal as possible, sent us to school. And my sister, being that much older, was obviously in a totally different part of the school. And I was, I guess, what would be kindergarten or first grade. I'm not sure exactly. But the teachers, not knowing I was a Jewish child, literally thought I was mute and there was something wrong with me. They didn't know what was happening to me. So at that point, I did the best I could, still, keeping the admonition of what my mother had said to us. It was not difficult for me to stay quiet because A, I didn't know the language, and B, I was terrified. And I recall one night, and we lived in the hotel in one room with a little, on the second floor of the hotel, in one room with a little stove, what do you call it? Gas stove or something like that. And I remember spending a lot of time by myself in that room. And I recall one night, two Germans opening the door, banging on the door and coming through and brandishing their rifles at my bed and yelling, "Vater, Vater." I assumed they meant father, father, and, wanted me to say something. And not only didn't I say something, but I was terrified. I just pulled the covers over my head and they kept banging on the foot of my bed. And finally, exasperated, they left. But I have this vision of just being so scared and terrified. At that point, I think my mother realized that for us to, what I forgot to say is that the hotel was requisitioned by the Germans because, they had walked at least a good part of the hotel. It was not a huge hotel, but they made their living quarters. And my mother realized this was not a good place for us to be. So she arranged for my sister and I to go to a boarding house that was run by a Protestant missionary family who had 5 grown-up daughters who were taking turns. And the reason I mention this is because it had an influence on my sister, who periodically would go to Africa on missions. And my sister, at one point, because of these girls and of this family, who, by the way, did not know we were Jewish, wanted to become a missionary later on as she was growing up. But anyway, so we moved to that boarding house.
And what was their name? Do you remember the family?
Yes,
name?
it was the Bergeret family. And the name of the girls were Antoinette, Nicole, Jeanne, Marie, and Elisabeth, 5 of them. So at this point, life kind of, to a certain extent, took a almost normalized, I wouldn't say normal, but more structured kind of aspect to our lives, which was in the most unusual circumstances, but had some kind of structure more. And I have a picture of the school, actually, of the boarding house. And some of the incidents that I recall happened during that time. And by then I was speaking French, and I was, this was probably 1941, 42. So in school, I started making, connections. I wouldn't say I don't recall having really good friends, but only one girl whose name was Nicole, also as one of the girls, that I could call a friend. Otherwise, I was not very sociable, and I think part of the problem was that I lived in hiding, more or less. We lived in open hiding, but still in hiding, keeping in mind that I was not to ever say, and I remember when my mother said, "You will live as a friend," she said, "Forget you are Czech, forget you're Jewish, forget I have a husband, forget you have a father." So keeping all this in mind, I didn't want to make any waves.
Can I ask, sorry to interrupt, a quick question. So you're talking about hiding in public, as it were. Did you keep your names, or did you?
Yes, that's the thing.
And what about papers and documents and things like that?
Oh, we had forged documents. My mother she burned whatever she had, and I remember that night also clearly, and had forged documents attesting that she was a widow and that we were Protestants.
And what do you remember about the burning?
The owner of the hotel where she worked helped her do that. I remember watching, but I didn't do any, and I just simply remember the fireplace where they burned these papers.
And I'm just trying to imagine for someone who was 6, 7 years old at this time, who's been separated from your father twice, and then the promise of seeing him again in London that's taken away from you as well, and also to your sister and to your mother. How did all of you cope at that moment when you couldn't get the boat to England?
Oh, that was pretty traumatic and emotionally wrenching. But I have to say, my mother had guts, as you'll see later, and she did the best she could. And my emotion, my sister was not. I don't know whether because she was so intellectual and so she was so maybe focused on more intellectual endeavors, did not show too much emotions, or because maybe she knew not to. I don't know. And interestingly enough, that's again an aside, but we never actually, as grown-ups, lived either in the same town or for a very short time in Montreal. We were there for maybe less than a year. And then as married grown-ups, we always had a very good relationship and a sister, but not a most close relationship because of the separation in age. By the time I grew up to be a young adult who could understand things better, she was already married and out and on her own and, living a totally different life than mine. And throughout older years also. And our husbands, I mean, in more mature time, this is all again aside, were very good friends, but at a distance. We always got together very well. We got on together very well, but we're never in close living situations. So, so from an emotional point of view, I don't know really how she felt, but I remember feeling very, very distraught as a child. I'm sorry, what was your question?
No, that was my question.
Yeah,
I'm just
yeah,
trying to imagine that kind of
yeah.
wrenching apart emotion.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the literal separation, but the
Yeah.
sort of emotional
Yeah,
one too. Going back to Cognac, do you remember any wartime refugees being there? Possibly other Jewish refugees
No.
Okay.
No, that I don't. Everyone I remember from Cognac was non-Jewish and friendly to us, but nothing was ever said. From the day that my mother said to us, forget it, I literally forgot about it. I mean, I never even used the word Jewish. And I don't recall any Jewish friends. Everybody that I recall in Cognac was French, Protestant or Catholic. We were sent. My mother sent us to Protestant Sunday school. So,
and did she remain in the hotel when you went to the boarding house?
Yes, she did. And there is more to that story. When the Germans invaded Cognac, they established a factory for manufacturing airplane parts for the Lufthansa.
Is this in 1942 when they occupied the south?
Yes, it was. Yeah, it was after it was occupied, obviously. Yeah. And so there were a lot of Germans, but this was early. That was in 1941. They invaded. It was, and she ended up we're still living in the hotel, but when she realized that the Germans had this factory going and they needed interpreters, she decided she would try to work for them. However, because she was under Gestapo surveillance, and I left that out, she was constantly questioned and harassed by the Germans, wanting to know where her husband was or where he had been. For some reason, I don't think they bought the fact that, I mean, some of them do. There were hierarchies of the Nazis. The local ones, the local command, they probably couldn't have cared less who she was. But the upper echelon were after her and after us. That's why when they were searching the hotel, they came into my room that evening because they were searching for her. Anyway, where was I? Yeah. So she wanted to work for them, but because she knew the Gestapo were after her, she didn't know how to go about applying for a job at the Keitel factory. And however, because she was speaking German and because she had been in the hotel and seen a lot of the local commandants and people who were the invaders, she had learned that the commandant in charge of the troops in Cognac was in private life a father of 7 children and possibly, I think she said to me later, a minister. So she had the guts to go to him and say to him, I know you need me in Keitel because you're looking for people who can speak French and English, French and German. But I don't know how to go about it because the Gestapo is after me and I am Jewish. And because she figured, I guess in her mind, she told us later that's what she thought. She was hoping that he would be considerate enough and, and that if she told him that he, A, would help her get the job, and B, stop the harassment from the Gestapo. And to her credit, he did. Whether he did it to save himself, because had he ever been known to say that we were Jewish to anyone, he would have been in trouble, or because he was, emotionally supportive or considerate and enough to not betray us. He never did betray us. And from that moment on, she was left alone.
So you think he knew you or just suspected that you were Jewish?
I think he knew. My mother told him we were. That's what I said. She had the guts to tell him because she was counting on the fact that he was a father of 7 and that because he had told her that, during various conversations at the hotel. In this thing, you have no idea the kind of relationships and conversations that were happening at the time. It was so she had learned how, I think through a direct conversation with him at one point, he had told her that he had 7 children in Germany, and that I think that he was a minister, actually.
Did she ever mention his name?
No, I don't remember his name. I think she might have meant, but I don't. I think it was, I should remember, Zimmler, I think, something like Zimmler, but I can't, I really don't, I can't testify for sure for that. So from that moment on, we were, she was left alone. But what she did when she joined the Keitel firm was at the same time join the French underground. And she was able, because of knowing what the Germans were after and what they were doing, and she heard a lot of conversations that were happening in the factory, and she was able to work for the French underground and managed to actually save a lot of, or some of the French young men who were supposed to go to Germany by forging their papers or having them do things that were more productive for France than, being sent to the front or what have you. I mean, and I mentioned this because later on this became an extremely important part of what happened to us after the liberation. So she worked on the surface for the Germans and for the French underground as well. At the end of the war, that whole time, she did not know whether my father was alive. He didn't know whether we were alive. We literally had no contact. I recall one time we got a letter through the Red Cross that spurred some suspicions from the Germans that something was happening coming from England. And that's when she started being harassed. But that was before that's at that point where she felt she needed to join the Keitel firm, I think.
And just before you get to the post-war period, quickly, what was her exact job in the Keitel firm? Do you know what she did there on day to day?
She was translating letters or documents that were verifying what the Germans were doing in France at that point, and what this particular firm was producing, what kind of what's the word? What they were producing for the Air Force, for the German Air Force, for the AFRA, and also knew through these various messages that were coming in. I don't know whether they were all paper messages. So at the time, there were no such thing as, there were telegraphs, and there were what do you call them? Anyway, things would come by through typewriters rather than, typewriters and carbon papers and telegraphs mainly. And she would interpret what was coming in. And things that were coming in were where they were going to bomb and what parts were needed for these planes and that kind of thing. And which also brings me to the fact, one of the things that I remember also very clearly was bombardments that we had, because the Allied knew of the factory that was important near Cognac, and the Germans were after bombing as many places as they could in France. And one thing I remember is recognizing which planes were which by the sound of the planes in the air. We would know they're Allied planes, and they were going to bomb the factory, or whether they were Germans who were going to bomb whatever they could. And we would run into shelters, and there were some funny things at times that were happening in the shelters. We were sometimes playing games, and we were, as children, and sometimes we would even do like homework. If at the bombardment, if sirens would sound when we're in class, sometimes the teacher would say, "Okay, take your work," and would finish in the shelters. We went in shelters with gas masks, so either we would do homework, or we would play games, guessing games, or have contests as to how long the sirens would or how long the raid would have last, and when were we getting out, or playing word games, or playing I remember playing telephone games with our gas masks. It was funny. No, but where was I? Oh, an incident that I recall very clearly that had an impact on the rest of my life was I was about 9 years old by then. I got sick and had to have my tonsils out. Otherwise, I could choke literally. I was very ill. And the French doctors had no, Cognac was not a huge town. The closest large town that had decent medical care was Bordeaux, which was about 60 miles away. But I was sick enough that the doctor said, you have to have my tonsils had to come out right away. But he couldn't get anesthetic because all the medical supplies and anesthetics were requisitioned was for the Germans. So I recall the doctor put me on my mother's lap and tied us both. He tied me to her and tied both of us to the chair. And he told me, open your mouth. He put something in my mouth. He put ice in and said, I have to cut your tonsils out. I recall the excruciating pain, I have visions of him going in with his scalpel, first cutting my tonsils and then pulling them out. And it was the most excruciating pain that I have ever felt, and that stood me well in for the rest of my life, because I'm totally immune to pain. I mean, I can take pretty well anything. That is one memory I have that will never leave me, I have to say. And after that, I mean, miraculously, I did recover, but I remember him not only during the operation, but after that, just throwing ice in my mouth and several days of really serious pain. And another incident I remember that is kind of funny is that happened in the boarding house. We had restrictions, and food was very scarce, but we had ration cards and what have you. But I was never really terribly, terribly hungry. But one day I recall being really hungry, and I walked into the kitchen of the boarding house, and I saw what looked like a jar of plum jam or so. And I was so hungry, I decided I would I took the jar and I put a spoon in it and put it in my mouth, and it was the most horrible thing that had happened to be some kind of liquid soap or something like that. It was pretty bad. Now I can laugh about it now, but at the time it was not particularly funny. It was just kind of ugly. But however, this brings me to the fact that despite the restrictions, and the Germans were well fed, the civil population not that well, but we never really experienced the kind of hunger that a lot of my family did, my extended family in the camps did. And I think that's part of what, I suffered for a long time of real survival guilt, and still do to some extent. I really do. Anyway, I don't know where I went off on that tangent after your question.
No, that's
what
absolutely
was
fine.
it?
A couple of, I've got two different questions I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask about, so your mother exhorted you to be a French Protestant and your sister. What was involved in that? What did you do?
Well, we went to Sunday school, Protestant Sunday school. We went to choir. We went to church every so often. I mean, pretty well every week, actually, you know. And again, as an aside, which is kind of interesting in our story, my sister became a real believer, and she stayed Protestant the rest of her life. Married a Jew, but remained Protestant herself. And so that's kind of, in my case, I never believed in anything. I'm pretty cynic, I think, in a way. I have never forgotten that I am Jewish, and I feel my roots are still in the Jewish culture, in the Jewish, maybe not so much in the Jewish religion as much as tracing down, going down, my Jewish heritage. I have remained very Jewish inside. So.
Do you think that's just a matter of personality, or do you think there's some way that your childhood experiences particularly kind of influenced you in that way?
I think so. Yeah, definitely. I think that and the war and the fact I didn't go into this, but post-war, when we found out that 19 members of our immediate family were murdered, and there were only 2 survivors of the extended family, one who ended up in Israel, and one who was saved only because she was married to a non-Jew. That played a big part in my wanting to remain Jewish and, move beyond what the Nazis did. I mean, they were after eliminating all the Jews of Europe. And why? There's no answer to that. But I just will never forget that what the genocide that was perpetrated.
You talked also, you mentioned just now about, the sense of survivor guilt. Can you talk about that some more? Or?
Well, yeah, why did I survive and they did not, Why I was lucky and I'm alive, but they're not. What I didn't go into in the post-war is that after we were reunited, which was, again, it's a story on its own, we eventually were reunited with my father. And even though in the surface that should have been a happy event, in my particular case, in my particular emotional being, it was very difficult because I had literally forgotten my father. And when we were reunited initially, and he found us in Cognac, he was a total stranger. By then I was 11 years old, but he was a total stranger. And we had no way of communicating because I was speaking French only. By then, I had totally forgotten my Czech, and he spoke English and Czech, and smattering of French, but not enough for us to really communicate. So it was an adjustment for me to, be reunited with him. It was an adjustment for my mother, and it was an adjustment for my sister. It was an adjustment for all of us. But for me particularly, I had the added difficulty of not being able to communicate with him. Whereas my sister, who was again, that much older and could speak, she had not forgotten her Czech. She could still speak Czech with him. And my mother also. So, and then there was a period of time where we, after the war, we did return to Prague. And at that point, my mother suffered a little breakdown, when we realized everything was gone that we had known. Everybody was gone. And we were in Prague for a period of about 6 months after the war. And things then had already changed. They were under communist era because they had been liberated by the Russians. And even for that short period of time, Eva and I attended school, and we had to learn the Azbuka. I can speak in Russian because it's quite close, the spoken Russian is understandable to some extent to the Czech, but the written, the Azbuka, is so totally different. So that was kind of stressful in its own way for me. But anyway, so we realized we would not stay, and my father knew we would not stay in Prague anymore. We would leave. And while he was in England, because of his connection and because of what he had experienced what I didn't say is that he was given, because I didn't know about that until after the war, he was assigned with the Czech troops, with the Czechs in exile. He got a position with the RAF.
Could we pause there? Because I think there's a few steps we've missed out, and I want to hear the story in full about your father. But I'm just wondering if we could finish up the France portion, the Cognac portion first. Would that be okay? Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's okay.
So we were talking about sort of really interested in normal life, trying to be a French Protestant. If there are any other sort of memories of the boarding house.
Yeah. Going, as I say, the raids, because we were bombarded quite often. Learning, going to regular school. I mean, teachers and learning math and literature and reading books and French literature, the normal things people do, that the schooling is. I was in, what would it be, whatever grade it was, I guess middle school. I was in middle school. And making I remember we did a lot of gymnastics, physical ed. I think partly, I don't know if more than normal or not, but I remember a lot of phys ed classes. I think just to get us out and, forget what was going on or whatever. I don't remember, but I do remember a lot of, and I remember actually learning how to climb. One of the things we did was climb ropes, and we played a lot of volleyball and basketball and that kind of thing. And I recall meal times were kind of, I don't know if I would call it fun, but they were social. They were nice times, I remember. Even though the food was not particularly good, we never had really. I certainly don't remember gourmet foods at all. But I do remember a lot of rutabaga. We used to, in French, I guess it's, I don't know what rutabaga would be in
It's rutabaga.
Rutabaga?
Yeah, it's like
right,
yeah.
Right. That was a lot of our meals, because that was something that you could probably grow fairly easily, and there was, and not particularly savory, I think. But anyway, we had a lot of that. We were very short of milk. Till this day, I have a lot of calcium problems because I never had, milk and dairy. So life in the boarding house was pretty structured. We'd go to school, we'd have meals, we'd have afternoon school and phys ed, as I say, a lot of phys ed, and to bed by 9 o'clock. We were all in our rooms, and I shared a room with 2 other girls. Yeah.
And who? It was the family that was it the Bergeret family
Yes,
that ran. It was
that
like
ran.
the school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And who were the other students there?
Who? I mean, you want names that I don't remember names. I remember some of the. I remember some of the first names, but I don't know. And they were people from various places of Cognac and surrounding areas of Cognac who would, some of the lesser towns or lesser villages that were surrounding Cognac. Cognac was the largest town, even though it was not big by any circumstance, but largest town in the Charente, which was surrounded by small hamlets or small towns like Jarnac and Adirac, and the next other largest city was Angoulême as well. But so some of the children of these surrounding towns would be there. This was a girls' school, by the way, only girls.
And only Protestant, or
that I don't know, honestly.
And was it a private school or a public school, a state school?
I think it was a private school, maybe a state school. I don't know. Sorry, I have a picture I have a picture of the school. Well, that's something I'd have to research. I never questioned that, honestly.
And I'm thinking, for someone who grew up in Prague, and then immediately before coming to Cognac was in Paris, so 2 of the grand cities of Europe. What did you notice as, 5, 6-year-old coming to Cognac, and what it was like in comparison to where you'd known up until then?
Well, all I can tell you is I knew it was different, and but I certainly was not of an age or of enough intellectual curiosity, perhaps, to wonder. Yeah, I mean, I never compared the two. I just took it for what it was. That's what it was. I remember the monuments and the beauty of Prague, and I remember the starkness of Cognac. But I never looked. I mean, no. Honestly, to answer your question, I didn't make any comparisons at the time.
And when you think back to your years in Cognac, is there a kind of a sort of a predominant overriding feeling you have about it, or is it more complex than that? Is that
the overriding feeling is that it allowed me to stay alive. And perhaps because I am one who, que sera, sera. That's where I lived, that's where at the time, that's what was happening, and God is there to maybe change things or not. I honestly never delved into some of what you've asked me.
I'm wondering, did your mother switch? I assume she must have done, but did she switch from speaking to you in Czech to speaking to you in French and your sister?
Yes, absolutely. From day one. From the time that she was told, forget your Czech, we spoke only French. And for many years afterwards, we kept it up. We spoke in French. And until the day she died, I spoke French with her.
And your sister too?
And my sister also.
And I don't think we finished the story of your mother and the resistance and the.
Right.
I wanted to ask, do you know, did she ever tell you how she connected with the resistance in the first place?
Yes, through the Nabholz family, because the son of the family, who was by then in his 40s, I don't know, did all he could to swindle, to do bad things to the Germans. He would pour, like, instead of give them good wine, he would mix it with water, or would even anyway. And instead of, he would try to undermine, and he was connected to the underground. So that's how she got into it.
And tell us about, I think you were going to tell us more about what happened, because I also wanted to ask about liberation, what you remember of that day, and then what happened subsequently.
The day of liberation, I recall, we were liberated by the Americans, and I remember the jeeps that they came in with with this star on the side of the jeeps and the American flags. And I remember running from the school onto one of the main plaza, one of the main roundabouts in Cognac, which was actually, there is a round place, they call it. How would you say it in English?
A square?
A square which is round. How do you call that? It's place in French, but there's got to be a word in English for it, right? Anyway, I don't know.
Probably, I can't think of it either.
And there's a statue of Jeanne d'Arc in the center of the. It's not a roundabout, but it's a round square. It's a round square. Anyway, and running to that area, which was the center of Cognac. and watching the jeeps come in, and the people with French flags and American flags and whatever. So that was, I remember that day very kind of clearly, and running and, embracing each other and that kind of thing. But that was also, for me personally, kind of short-lived, because right after the liberation, my mother was put in prison by the French as a collaborator because she had worked for the Germans. And so that was another shock for me. And by then I was 11 years old, and I was totally, distraught, not knowing how long she'll be in prison, whether she'll get out, or whether, what was going to happen to me and Eva, and what were we going to do. So this was not a very happy time for me. And I recall visiting her in prison. And actually, believe it or not, I also remember cigarettes were a big thing in those days, and cigarettes were part of surviving, actually. And she smoked a lot. And I remember going through the streets, picking up cigarette butts in order to roll cigarettes for her to bring to prison for her. And but fortunately, her stay in prison was not too long. It was only about 2 months, because the people that she worked with in the underground and the guys, the various people that she literally personally helped, vouched for her, wrote letters, presented them to the authorities, like she was really not working. She was working on the Germans for the surface, but she really helped the French, and that allowed her to be liberated, to be left out of prison. And I have many of the letters that were written. I still have that today. So,
let's take a break there. Sonia, can you tell us how you got from France back to reuniting with your father in the UK?
No, we did not. We were not united in the UK. He came to Cognac. He knew if we were anywhere that we would be in Cognac, because that's what they had arranged initially. And I remember that meeting as I think we went into this kind of difficult for me emotionally. What occurred after that is we returned to Prague for a short while. And while my father was in England during the war years, he had joined the RAF. And he had, through connections and the skills he had from previous law work in I don't know exactly how, honestly, but he had established a relationship with some diplomatic people in Europe, and was asked to go to the formation, as a delegate of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, he was sent to the formation of the United Nations. And he attended that meeting in 1945. And at that point was made an executive of the International Civil Aviation, which is a branch of the UN, and the seat of which was in Montreal, Canada. So after the war, after having returned to Prague, we went to Montreal, where my father became an executive in what is called ICAO, and still exists today and still is in Montreal. That's how we ended up in Montreal in 1946. Did I answer your question or not?
Yes, absolutely. And what do you remember about... Well, I was going to say, before we get there, how was it for you adjusting from your life under occupation to your life not under occupation?
Well, before I get to that, my first adjustment came when we actually left Europe to go to Canada. We went by ship, and I remember the crossing as very difficult physically in terms the waters were very rough. The ship was full of people emigrating, and there was a lot of sickness. There was a lot of apprehension as to what we were going to find. And there was a mixture of, personally, I felt a mixture of and I think for my parents as well, actually, of loss of leaving the country, leaving Europe, and apprehension as to what were we going to find in the new country. But all that went kind of by the wayside when we realized that we were free. We didn't have anyone to threaten us. We had freedom to say what we wanted. We had freedom to be ourselves, even though I have to admit I didn't really know who I was at this point. But so it made up for the discomfort of the crossing itself. So we arrived in Halifax. From Halifax, we took the train to Montreal. Disembarking leaving the train in Montreal was another kind of almost shock in a way, because Canadians speak both English and French. However, the French was very different from the French that I knew. And at some point, I really could hardly understand them. So that was another kind of adjustment for me for a while. But on the other hand, the Canadians were very friendly, very open, very welcoming. And it did not take me very long to, adjust to that. But the initial arrival was kind of a shock, I have to say.
What was the name of the ship, by the way?
I I want to say the Mauritania. I think it was the Mauritania. Yeah. But after a while, then by then I was in high school, and we would be entering high school. I was still finishing. Yeah, I was 12 years old. Middle school was, I started middle school and then went on to high school. And in Montreal, there was a school which was run as the French system, and that was Collège Marie de France, where I went and finished my high school there.
And what part of Montreal was that?
That was in the Snowdon area, if you know Montreal, on Côte des Neiges, actually. And it was called Collège Marie de France. Right now, it is still there. The Collège Marie de France is still there, but it's moved physically. I think it's in Outremont now, not in the same area. And where was I? And we managed to, so now we felt very secure and more kind of getting to live a, quote, normal life. However, for me, I was...
Joanna Brody, or one other.
Let me take that. Where was I? Yeah. Went to school. Are you recording?
I restarted, yeah.
Oh, okay. So I was, so the few years that we were, the beginning in Montreal was an adjustment for my parents. By then I was old enough to realize it was difficult for them to really, they each had their own lives in the 6 years of the war, were separated. It was a little bit difficult to be a happy family again. By then, I also started kind of, even though initially I wasn't relating to my father because we couldn't speak the language, but over time we kind of started reestablishing a relationship. But unfortunately, about 5 years after we got to Montreal, he dropped dead of a heart attack at age 53, just at the time where I was starting as a young adult. I was 18 by then. I was starting to really relate to him and understand him and, have a relationship. So that was a big loss for me, again, socially. Emotionally. What was your question initially?
Well, just you answered it really, just about the adjustment to real life during peacetime from the stresses you were under during the war.
Right. No, it was it took a little while, but it was the few years before my father died that we had in Montreal were happy, I would say, or content anyway. And my parents did, and we had a fairly, again, they managed to have a fairly full social life. A lot of Czechs. There was a lot of Czech immigrants, and we had. There was even a big Czech group in Montreal where every year the women would do bazaars with, with Czech dancers and a lot of traditional Czech, what's the word I'm looking
for?
Customs, right. right?
Did you grow
And
up going to
dance
these
and
kind of events?
yes,
Yeah.
and dances we would have every so often. And I met young people of my age who were Czech people of my age, and actually, strangely enough, again, you know what the human psyche, whatever it is. I guess you retain your mother's tongue because Czech came back to me. And I can today, even though I never really had any Czech schools, I can speak Czech, read Czech, and write Czech. And it's not an easy language. So, you know, that speaks to, I guess, the psyche, you know, within us. What else can I?
Question. Well, a couple of questions. First, were you involved with kind of Jewish life in Montreal?
Yes, to some extent we were. We joined the temple. There
Which
was
one? Sorry.
And it burned down, actually. I should know. Is it Temple Bethel? I think it was Temple Bethel. And shortly after my father died, what I didn't say is that, so after I finished high school, I went to McGill. I was going to try to go to medical school. And I had applied to McGill but when my father dropped dead and I was left alone with my mother, by then my sister had married, had left home, had left to be with her husband. And for the first year, they were in Montreal, and then they moved to Toronto. So I was left alone with my mother, who by then was getting pretty fragile. And I realized that I really should probably not go to medical school because of the time it would take. And the training was a long training and expensive training and what have you. So I decided to opt for something within the field, but not as long a training. And I went to a physical and occupational therapy school. And I graduated in 1957 from McGill and went right to work and happened to meet my husband in the hospital. Then 2 years later.
What was his name?
His name was Gary Brody. I mean, obviously, my last name today is Brody, and that was his name. And we were married I graduated in 1955. We were married in 1957. And we stayed in Montreal. I supported my mother until then, and then we started, we helped her out as well. But the first 2 years that I was left alone before I was married, I really, helped my mother because she was getting kind of more fragile, I would say.
And then did you go to the US, or what happened then?
Yes. So we were married in Montreal. We stayed in Montreal for he had 2 more years of, he did experimental surgery at McGill. And then he went into general surgery and did his training. We moved from Montreal, we moved to Georgetown, to Washington, D.C., to Georgetown, where my husband did his general surgery training. And he had decided he would specialize in plastic surgery, but in rehabilitation surgery. And for that training, we went from Washington after he got his boards in general surgery. We went to Pittsburgh to do his training in plastic surgery. And we had decided that while we were in Washington, that we liked Washington very much and would come back to DC to open practice, which we did after he finished his boards in plastics. We returned to DC, where he practiced for. He opened practice in Washington and Arlington. He had 2 offices. From there, the first year he was in practice, an offer came to him to go on an expedition to Easter Island. And it's a do you want me to go into this?
Sure.
It has nothing to do with the war. His former experimental surgery chief called him up and said, there is a World Health expedition going to Easter Island to study a remote population before it's opened up to, they were going to make an airfield and open up, and it's one of the very few really isolated population, and the World Health wanted to study the population from every aspect, everything from disease. I mean, they had every kind of aegis that you could possibly find. And before it's opened up to civilization, because until then, Easter did not even have money. When they left on the expedition, they took things with them that for barter. So I gave a lot of my old clothes, my tablecloth, curtains, everything that they would barter with you. And interesting. Anyway, that has nothing to do with the war.
Did you go to Easter Island?
I did not. That was an expedition strictly for the scientists, so I did not go on that. The funny part about it is that they had a great time. There was Easter Island Foundation has the whole history of this, and again, that's a whole book, so I won't go into it. But all this to say that was the first year in practice. So as soon as he got open practice, he had just maybe 3 or 4 patients. So he said, "Sure, I'm going," and he asked my permission, and I said, "Yeah, well, go." By then, I had 3 kids, and I was left alone for about 6 months with the 3 children while he was having a good time in Easter Island.
How old were the kids then?
Well, they were, let's say, Alan was almost 4, Jeff was 3, and Joanna was just born. So they were. Anyway, but he came back, and he had a really good, after that, he really became serious about opening practice, and he had an office with one of his old chiefs, actually, and everything was really going very well. We were very happy in Washington. And another thing that life brings, an unexpected encounter with a friend of a friend who was an orthopedic surgeon in Los Angeles, had come to Washington for a convention. He met Gary. He said, USC is looking for somebody to open a plastic surgery branch of surgery at USC. Would you consider coming to California? And I said, absolutely not. I'm very happy there. I mean, I said, I don't want to go to California. It's too far. I have no desire to go to California. Anyway, to make a long story short, again, I won't go into it. It took us 2 years, but he finally decided that what they were offering him was everything he wanted. He private practice with a professor position and a research position, the three areas that he really was interested in.
So he was on the faculty at
He
USC.
was in faculty at USC. He actually opened the plastic surgery department at USC. And right now, I mean, he passed away now 2 years ago, and there is a lectureship in his name at USC. So.
How was the adjustment to life in Los Angeles from
It was
DC?
tough. It was tough initially.
When did you move? What year was this?
1972. 1972. I found it very difficult. We had made a couple of trips before, and every time I came out, I said, no, I don't want to live in LA. It was too big, too plastic. I didn't think I could put roots anywhere with 3 children. I didn't know anyone here. And despite the nice weather, which actually it wasn't at the time, there was so much smog that I was turned off by the smog. And all the pretty names they have here, like, the gardens, various, didn't mean anything when you drove through them. It was pretty horrible. So, as I say, it took us 2 years, but we finally made it. And so we've been here, I've been here since then, and now my children are all Californians, and so are my grandchildren.
And how about you? You mentioned when we were having lunch that you went back to school.
That's right. I went when I was working. Yeah, what I didn't mention is, when I was working in therapy, in physio and occupational therapy, I realized that I was trained at McGill very practically, and that obviously there is a lot of psychology going into rehabilitation. So I decided if and when the time came that I would be in a position to go back to school, I would, and I would like to get a degree in psychology. And that time came in my late 40s when the children were already, in college or going off to college or something. And my husband was well established. We were in good position. I went back to school, and I did a PhD in psychology. And then I went to work.
Where did you do the PhD?
At Rancho Los Amigos in USC, which
Where
was
the
a branch of
PhD from?
USC. The California Graduate Institute, which was a part of UCLA. I did my training at UCLA and got. So that was it. And then in my years, I had a practice of my own, but also found a niche kind of within psychology and within rehabilitation psychology. I worked a lot with body dysmorphic disorders, with people who had physical disabilities, burns, and through my husband's office, actually, I had a lot of referrals from plastic surgeons who dealt with a lot of cancer surgery, breast reconstruction, and that kind of thing. For several years, I was in practice for about 10 years before I retired.
And how's retirement been for you?
Pretty horrible.
Why?
Because all of a sudden I had no goal, and I've always been helpful, and I didn't have, I felt that I did not have I wasn't useful enough. And that's what I kind of missed. But the reason I retired is because my husband was also retiring, kind of, and he's a little bit older than I, and he started having some physical difficulties, and so I ended up by taking care of him in the past few years, and until he passed away. But I would not advise retirement for anyone who can stay active. But
you said earlier when you were telling me about coming to Canada and the kind of adjustment and the sense of realizing that you are now free, you said you had a comment. It was something like, "I didn't know who I was then." Was there a time when you did have a sense of who you were, or how would you think about that?
Oh, I know who I am now pretty well, but what I meant by then, I never stopped questioning mankind, I would say, and humans. And what are we all about? What is life all about? Is the kind of thing that, it's one thing to live from day to day, and you are engaged in, but when you really try to determine what life is, I'm having difficulties with that. And I think one of my difficulties is that perhaps I don't have enough faith. I think I've lost faith in mankind. And I think people who have what I would say real faith and believe in God or believe in something that is greater than they are better off. And to that point, I think that perhaps it is my war years. I don't know. But I think I'm a little bit of a cynic. And I think I also, at the same time, however, one of the things that I definitely think was because of my early experiences, I don't like to make waves. I am extremely observant. I know what is going on, but actually to the point where my own children thought for a long time that I had eyes in the back of my head, but I do not like to make waves. I do not like to be seen. I am always kind of in the background. I like to be in the background. And I think that comes from my early time of, not wanting to be seen, not to be seen, and having to be, invisible more or less.
Do you think having children impacted that one way or another?
You mean in terms of my personality? I don't think so. I think I've been a good parent. I think I've got an okay mother. Fortunately, touch wood, we're a decent family. I haven't had any major problems in terms of, one kid, drugs or murders or anything like that. And all three of my children have been quite successful and doing very well. I now have 8 grandchildren. one of my son went into business, and he's done very well. The other is an ER doctor, and my daughter has her own public relation firm and doing quite well. So, and the grandchildren seem to be this far doing quite well as well. So, I'm very, I feel very blessed in a way. But what I came out with, I think, is not only, that I don't like to make waves or anything like that, but what I want to leave as a legacy to my children is that they never become hateful of anything. That I think hate and misunderstanding and violence, the one thing that I'm off again in a tangent, the one thing I never wanted to have maybe I went too far with it, but I never allowed anything German in my home. Never wanted a German car in my driveway, never even wanted a German sewing machine. I remember somebody gave me a Pfaff machine. I said, absolutely not. Perhaps I carried this too far, but that's the way I felt. And I do not that I have hatred for the Germans, and I know the Germans today are certainly not responsible for what happened then. But I have enough pain, if you will, within me to really say this should never happen again. And I want my children growing up with acceptance and nonviolent solutions to problems. I'm very active in the anti-gun movement, and if I don't see any reason for anyone to have any guns. I am very anti-gun. And Sorry, I went off kind of.
No. It was really interesting. I wanted to ask about trips that you've made back to either to Prague since you left, and or to Cognac, and if so, what that was like.
Well, Cognac. I went back to Cognac only once since the war years, and that was back in the early 80s. And a lot of the people I knew had left. The hotel was not there anymore. And the town was, I wouldn't say a disappointment, but I remembered it obviously much bigger and or kind of different. The only thing that was still the same to me was that the place that I described earlier. And I have one memory of the after liberation that comes to me now as you ask me that. And I don't know if I should say that on the recording, but after the war, after the liberation, when my mother was put in prison, I remember that they were dragging women who had done favors for the Germans, dragging them around the plaza, kind of naked. That's something that also stayed in my memory. Right. So that was, it brought back a lot of, when I went back to Cognac, because I wanted the children to see, and my husband, we went as a family. And so I did not have very happy memories, I have to say. I went back to the street where I was, Le Rue Plumejo, but as I say, the hotel per se wasn't there anymore. And there was no one that I knew anymore there. And so it was interesting, but not, it was emotional in that it brought some memories back that I had possibly put in the back of my head and didn't remember. And when I, saw certain, like this plaza thing, for instance. As far as Prague goes, Prague I went to back several times. The last time actually was just 2 years ago when my children decided that they wanted, after my husband had died, they wanted to take me on a trip by myself to places that I wanted to go. So I chose, one of the places was, we went to Montreal, we went to Prague, and we went to Iceland. And the reason I chose Iceland is because my father had always, during his tenure in ICAO, he had gone to one of the places he was working in was Iceland, and he had always told me stories about Iceland and how interesting it was, and I had never gotten to it. So that's what we did that time. And Prague was as beautiful as it always was. It's one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And I really enjoyed being in Prague. The first time I went back after the war, it was still, it was under the communist era. And at that time, it was still pretty, even though you could see the beauty under that had never changed because of the monuments and what have you, but everything was kind of gray and people were not particularly happy. I remember, they were wearing their raincoats and carrying their bags. And the very first time we went, the restaurants were still, they would give you a menu, but they said this wasn't on, this wasn't available, or they gave you glasses that were, we can go up to a quarter of a glass instead of a full glass kind of thing. But that was when it was under the communist era. The next trip we did was when, after Václav had the Prague Spring, and that was totally different. Prague was much full of life, and the 2 years ago, it was just a wonderful, wonderful trip. But we went to I don't know how familiar you are, but Prague has a Jewish cemetery that is the oldest Jewish cemetery and Jewish synagogue in the world, I believe, at least in Europe. And I found the names of my family members in there. And that was very emotional, but something necessary for me to do, to see that. Yeah.
Did you ever, or have you ever, since the end of World War II, have you ever experienced any anti-Semitism?
Not really personally. I have to say that I found I found the American Jews a little, I don't want to say superficial, but I had difficulties relating to the American Jews initially. And I think it's because maybe I felt that, or I felt that they felt I wasn't Jewish enough. In that I did not necessarily, because still we belonged to a temple. Both my boys had bar mitzvahs. But I was not, just like maybe it comes back from, my early childhood as well. I was not a devoted, practicing Jew, as many Americans would have wanted me to be. But I have not encountered personally any anti-Semitism, although I know it exists, and I think there is more of it lately than earlier on. And I have never been ostracized from somewhere because I was Jewish. In fact, an interesting aside again, we lived for a while when we first arrived in Los Angeles, in the Pasadena, San Marino area. And there is a club in Pasadena that was close to the Jews initially. And most of my children's friends were non-Jews. No, actually, I wouldn't say most, about half and half. And they went to school with half and half. Actually, my older son has two rather prominent Jewish friends, and they're still friends. I mean, my son is in his 60s now, and he's still friends with them. One of them was the son of a Caltech physicist, and they grew up with non-Jews, went to Polytechnic School in Pasadena, where there were all kinds of children, and they were known as Jews, but they were not ostracized in any way. And I felt very much the same way, even though we had very good, very old California residents, California natives, who, as friends, who were non-Jews. One of them actually was the mayor of San Marino, very definitely non-Jewish, but were very accepted, were very good friends and very accepted. So I did not experience, anti-Semitism then.
Do you, when you think about what you went through, before and during the war, and more broadly the treatment of Jews during the war, obviously the Holocaust, do you draw, when you think about the world, do you draw any parallels between that experience and the treatment of other groups of people, like aspects of oppression or persecution of other groups? Do you draw parallels or not?
Yes, I do, because I think it all comes to acceptance of human beings, one to the other. I do. I don't think that there's been any, I don't know, when you think about the Hutus and maybe there was, I still don't think there's never been anything quite as horrific and as all-encompassing as the Holocaust, and as cruel. And when you think of Mendele and the experiments on children and on the on human beings, and the extent of it, I don't think has any parallels. But I definitely think when you hear about what some people do to other people or some race does to another, I do think it is horrific.
Are there conclusions you draw about humans and, I mean,
Don't get me into that. Well, all I can say is, it should not happen. I think humans we have enough intellect and we have enough emotional life that I think we should learn to live one in peace. I don't see it happening, unfortunately, but that's what I would like ideally to happen. Mm-hmm.
What are your feelings about the October the 7th, the Hamas attacks on Israel and the subsequent war that's happened?
I think it was horrible. It was unexpected. It was unwarranted. And I am obviously distraught by, how many Palestinians are being hurt by what is happening. But I also think that's something that should not have happened to start with. And I think Israel has the right to live, and I think they are open to a two-state solution, and it's the Palestinians who don't want it. So, and that's not, we don't hear about that. We don't hear about the fact that Israel is open to the fact of living close to one another. I have been to Jerusalem many times, not four times, and it's quite obvious that Palestinians are living next to Israelis, and we don't hear about that in the press. I think part of the problem is the press, is the spread of news that is one-sided, and I don't see any reason that Palestinians and Israelis should not live in peace with one another.
For you, what significance is there, if any, about sharing your testimony with us today?
Well, obviously, I did it willingly, and I would hope that future generations may learn from us, and that's why I decided to do it. Hopefully, leave the younger generation some food for thought, and for them to realize that for the world to function, they should avoid what we have lived through and do their best to be understanding and tolerant of one another and nonviolent, and all the everything we went through that they should try to avoid. Okay.
Thank you. Let's take a break and then come back and do some photographs.
Oh, okay.
Sonia, please tell us who's in this photograph.
This photo is from my grandparents on my mother's side, Bedřich and Hermina Kafka, and it was taken in 1937 in one of the parks in Prague.
Thank you. Please tell us about this photo.
This is a picture that was taken in 1939 before we left Prague of my mother, my sister, and I.
Thank you. Please tell us about this photo.
This is a photo that was taken shortly before we left Prague, and this was the last time I saw my grandparents and my uncle and aunt. And it is a picture of my grandparents, the Kafkas, and my aunt, my mother's sister, and her husband, and my mother, my sister, and I. That was taken, as I say, shortly in 1939, September 1939, before we left.
And what's the name of your aunt?
Milada and Lederer.
Thank you. And who is in this photograph?
In this photograph is my grandfather in the lighter coat and my great uncle, his brother, at the cemetery by the place where a cousin Kafka was buried. And that was taken in 1941, I believe. You can see them wearing the yellow stars.
And what was the great uncle's name?
He was Oldřich.
Thank you. And who is in this photograph?
In this photograph is my mother and I in front of the entrance to the hotel where we lived. That was taken, I believe, in 1941. And it is the only photo I have of the hotel, which was at 9 Rue Plumegeau in Cognac.
Thank you. And please tell us about this photo.
This is the building of the boarding house, the Bergeret house, that served both as a boarding house and a school, where my sister and I lived for a couple of years, and that was run by a missionary family, Protestant missionary family.
And this was in Cognac?
In Cognac.
Also.
Yes.
Thank you. And what is shown in this photo?
This is the only photo of my school years during the war. It was taken in 1944, as it says on the picture. And there are a couple of grades in here, I believe. And some of the friends I had in school. And it's a remembrance of younger years.
Thank you. Oh, where are you in the photograph? Can you point to yourself?
Let's see, I am, I believe, oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Right here.
And is your sister there too?
No, my sister is not. This was, no, she was ahead. We were in very different areas of the school, with her being 5.5 years older than I.
Thank you. please tell us about this photo.
This photo was taken in 1945 after the liberation, when my father came to and found us in Cognac. And it is my father, my mother, my sister, and I, with the director of the school at the back, Madame Bergeret.
Thank you. Sonia, please tell us about these photographs.
Well, obviously, these are photos taken by a photographer, I imagine, of my sister and myself. The top row is my sister. The bottom row is I. This was taken in 1936. The two center photos are of myself, and the two outside larger photos are of my sister, Eva.
Thank you. Please tell us about these photos, or this photo.
This is a photo taken, I believe, in 1936 or 30, possibly 37, I'm not exactly sure, of my parents and my sister and I at the beach.
Do you know where the
vacation, beach? I do not remember exactly where it was. Sorry.
Thank you. Who is in this photograph?
In this photograph are my parents, my sister, and I, vacationing in the Tatra Mountains. We used to do a lot of skiing and having snow fun.
And roughly when might it have been taken?
I believe 1937.
Thank you. And who is shown in this picture at the top here?
This is a picture of Churchill and President Benesch holding his hat, reviewing, I believe, reviewing the troops in exile in England.
Do you know roughly what year this might have been?
It must have been towards the end of 1939.
Thank you. And please tell us about this photograph.
This photograph was taken during the war. I'm not sure of the exact year, when my father was in the RAF as a flight officer. I don't know very much about the other two aviators he is with, but they were obviously serving together.
And which one is your father?
My father is the one in the center.
Thank you. Sonia, please tell us about this photograph.
This photograph was taken in 1945 after the end of the war, at the formation of the United Nations, where my father was a representative of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. And he is seated right here. Right here.
And where was this taken, do you know?
In San Francisco, I believe.
Thank you. Sonia, please tell us about what's shown here.
This is a monument called the Winged Lion that was given to Prague in 2014 by England to commemorate the Czech RAF squadrons, and the emotional tie for me is that I found my father's name on the how do you call them?
The plaque.
On the mark, on the plaques. So the next one. So here is my father's name. Flight. Oops, again.
Right at the top there.
Yeah, Flight Officer Joseph.
That's okay.
Here's Joseph Dubsky, Flight Officer Joseph Dubsky. Okay.
Thank you.